Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello? What? Oh, no. I think everybody can hear me. Can you hear me all right? All right. That's clear enough. Okay, how about now? Okay, we'll try it again. How about now? Third time's a charm. Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm Phil Van Kampen, Village President. I also want to mention there's a couple other Village Board members here. I see Jason Mankey and Tim Higgins and Tom Kirchstauber is also here. As you know, we're here to give you more information about the upcoming referendum. And what we'll do is Martin Shanks is here with us, Village Administrator, and he will give a short presentation about what's going on, and then of course afterwards we'll time for questions. So we'll have plenty of time, and we appreciate you all coming. And like I said, Martin will start his presentation, and then we'll do questions and answers. Thank you.
By my notes. All right, so thanks, Phil. As Phil mentioned, my name is Martin Shanks. I'm the Village Administrator for Oregon. I've been here with the Village for almost 4 years. It'll be 4 years in May. My role is really to serve the Village Board and support the board and to oversee the day-to-day operation of the Village. So as Phil mentioned, we're going to kind of talk through a little bit of the journey of how we are where we are today with the referendum and why it's being put forward and what it's all about. We're going to start with this presentation here, and then we'll do some Q&A. The presentation sort of takes a couple of sort of chunks here. The first one is a little bit more about challenges that the village has faced and some of the driving factors about why the referendum is being proposed. And then the next section will cover a little bit about how those challenges are impacting on village services. And then the last part will cover the referendum that's been put forward and how that can potentially address some of the things that we've covered. So that first part, we're going to talk about challenges. I think this first slide is something that I think all of us can relate to, and that is simply inflation. I think all of us have experienced that and understand that pretty well the last couple of years. Costs on seemingly everything are going up, right? So the village government is not insulated from that, of course. The village has to pay employees. The village buys supplies like road salt, for example, purchases different services. We have to pay utility bills to keep the electricity on. And so, of course, what we've experienced in our personal lives, we're, of course, experiencing with the village government as well. And importantly, and I'm sorry, I'm standing kind of like in front of all of you over here. I have some notes on my computer, so I might have to jog back and forth here. So, importantly, that last sentence, I think, is something that I like to highlight to people when talking about this. Growth is obviously a big factor of what's influencing some of these challenges with the village, but growth has some challenges and growth has some benefits, and there's some trade-offs there. But with inflation, even if we're not growing, even if we're a community that is just standing still, inflation is impacting all communities, whether they're growing or not growing, regardless. And so, again, if things are stagnant, just the cost to provide services and do what we do is rising regardless. So this is important in the context of this next slide here and the challenges with the village's primary sources of revenue. So in Wisconsin, local governments are somewhat restricted in the types of revenues that we're able to collect. For example, in Wisconsin, local governments don't have a sales tax. We can't have that. We don't have an income tax, which some states have. And even some fees and charges that we may be able to use are somewhat limited and restricted. So there are some limitations there as well. And so really the law is sort of written to really push communities towards primarily the use of the property tax. And so for most communities, their revenue mix for paying for ongoing operating costs is really like two primary sources: property tax and then shared revenue, which is money that local governments receive from the state. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But for the village, the property tax makes up 60% of what we can cover with our ongoing operating costs. And so, as I mentioned, growth in the community is a huge factor here. So with property tax, and I want to kind of back up because a lot of people understand this, but a lot of people don't. So when you get your property tax bill, you have a chunk of money that you gotta pay to the village, or if you pay in two chunks to the village and to Dane County. And a lot of people don't realize the village doesn't keep all that money, right? It goes to other taxing jurisdictions as well. So 53% of your property tax bill this last year went to the school district. 29% of it went to the village. 14% went to Dane County, and 4% went to the Madison Technical College. So that's an important thing to know. So we get, for every dollar in property taxes that you spend, 29 cents of that comes back to the village. And then in that amount that comes to the village, there's an even further distinction. There is really two buckets of funding that we use property taxes for. Now, number one is ongoing operating expenses. So stuff that we do every year, right? We have to pay employees' wages, we have to pay the electric bill, utility bills, we got to buy certain supplies, we have services that we provide to the village, and those costs happen every year, right? Then there's the second bucket that these property taxes go to, and that is towards servicing the village's debt. So the village does projects and builds libraries, builds new streets and that sort of thing. And so the village will take out debt, and we'll have just a payment schedule, pay back that debt over 10 years, 20 years, sometimes 30 years even. And so when we go to set the property taxes, we have our payment schedule for our debt. And under Wisconsin law, the amount of property tax that you can raise for making your debt payments, very flexible. So there is a statutory cap to the amount of debt that local governments can have, and the village is within somewhere in the 40% right now, which is pretty low for most communities. And so if there's $1 million that we need from property taxes to pay for our debt payments, we can raise $1 million from property taxes to make those payments. Now, if the next year our debt payments are half that, let's say they're $500,000, then we can only take $500,000 to make those debt payments. We don't get to keep that extra $500,000 that we had the prior year. So it's not an ongoing rolling basis for those debt payments. We just get to take what we need in order to be able to cover it. And if it's less than what it was the year prior, then we don't get to raise those dollars again. So back to the other side, the operating side. Obviously, we need those dollars on a rolling basis because those are services that we have every year, right? We got to pay our employees' wages. We don't want to have to question whether we can provide police services every year, right? We want to have a very consistent and reliable source of revenue. And so those dollars we get to keep every year. So if we raised $5 million for services with property taxes, we get to raise $5 million the next year and the year after that. But the real restriction on this side is that the village and local governments in Wisconsin don't have the discretion to raise that just however they want. It is very specifically tied primarily to new construction value that's constructed in your village. So you cannot raise your property taxes that you spend for ongoing operational expenses unless your community is growing. And not just growing in any way, but just very specifically in new construction. So that's your primary source of revenue for government services is entirely tied to growing. And so that's where we have these trade-offs where, in the face of inflation and sort of things like that, the only way that we can sort of support our services in an ongoing basis is simply by growing, because that's our primary revenue source. And so for many years, this generally worked out pretty well for the village because we are growing. And this chart here sort of shows that. Shows the increase in our property taxes based on that new construction value that I mentioned. And so that's the orange part right here. So you can see in 2017, the village was able to raise that portion of the property taxes for ongoing revenue, ongoing operational expenses by about maybe 2.5%. 2018, about 3.5%. 19, 3.75% maybe. 2020, 2.5%. 2021, about 2% even. So overlaying that with the annual inflation rate, going back to that last slide that we had, this kind of worked out well for the village. In 2017, inflation was about 1%. 2018, just about 2%, a little over 2% in 2019, a little under 2% in 2020, and again lower, maybe 1.5% there in 2021. So the village was able to basically grow itself into making sure that it could maintain its existing services and keep up with what was relatively low inflation, but also beyond that, because obviously we're growing and our services are having to deal with more demand and that sort of thing. So that worked out pretty well for about 20 years. The limitation that I was talking about for property taxes, that's been in place since about 2006 in the state of Wisconsin. So then, of course, 2022, 2023, 24, last year, that changed pretty dramatically, obviously. So 2022, we had about a 3% increase that we were allowed to take in new property taxes to pay for those ongoing operating expenses. Inflation was 5%. 2023, we were about, our increase to our property taxes was about 2.5%. Inflation was over 8%. Last year, we were able to grow about 3%. Inflation was still at about 3 to 4% again. And it's still elevated at that 3%. So this is where things got kind of wonky with our ability to keep up with those ongoing costs. Not only are we growing, we're getting a little bit from that growth, but now costs are starting to kind of get away from us. And this is obviously not unique to the Village of Oregon. This is happening everywhere in Wisconsin right now. Before 2020, between 2006, when these levy limits went into place for property taxes, and 2020, there's something like 100 referendums over the course of those 15 years throughout the entire state of Wisconsin. There's been about 100 referendums just in the last 3 years alone. So this sort of dynamic of the revenue structure for local governments in Wisconsin, combined with the inflation that we've seen, has really caught up to many local governments. And as I mentioned, it's not unique to growing communities. In fact, growing communities have had a little bit more flexibility to be able to exist and operate within this dynamic. And a great example is, this last November, there was 4 referendums in Dane County for communities. 2 of those communities, City of Monona, Village of Maple Bluff, they're not growing communities necessarily. They are landlocked communities, particularly Maple Bluff, which is primarily a residential community, about 1,000 people, 1,300 people live there. They asked for a 22% increase to their operating levy. They're not growing, but they're faced with that inflationary factor, so they need some additional dollars to keep up with that. Monona was another example. They have a little bit more opportunity for redevelopment on some of those big corridors they have, but they're landlocked. They don't grow quite at the rate that even the Village of Oregon grows, or even City of Madison, City of Fitchburg, which were 2 other communities that went for referendums. City of Monona went for a 30% increase in their referendum. Both those communities passed their referendums. But again, communities like City of Madison, City of Fitchburg that also went for referendums in November, they do have capacity to grow. Their increase that they requested as part of the referendums were much smaller. City of Madison 7%, City of Fitchburg was something, I'm blanking on it, but I think it was 15-14% in that range, because they're growing. They have a little bit more flexibility. They're facing some of these issues, so they didn't need quite as much to ask when they had to go to referendum. The other source of funding that local governments receive, primary source of revenue that local governments receive for funding ongoing operating costs, is sort of this umbrella term of shared revenue. So this is money that the state of Wisconsin collects through a variety of different means, sales tax, other things that they collect and tax from residents. And then they give that money back to local governments to spend on local government services. And there's a few programs that are tied very specifically to different types of things. There's a program within shared revenue, it's called highway aids. These are monies that the state gives us to maintain roads and do that sort of thing. But there's often some limitations and some restrictions and conditions on some of these dollars. In the case of highway aids, you actually have to spend more money to get more money. And if you spend less, they actually give you less. So there's a little bit of a tug and pull there. There's also some dollars that they give specifically for fire and EMS services and that sort of thing. The biggest source of shared revenue is something called county and municipal aid, which is essentially unrestricted. They give communities dollars that local governments can basically use however they want. And that's what this graph here is showing. And in 2003, the amount of shared revenue or revenue that we received from this program from the state peaked at just over $400,000. It was a pretty big change to the state law that year. And then ever since, over those last 20 years, you can see those dollars have dipped pretty considerably. In fact, in 2023, we received just over $230,000 from this. And you can see the line here, adjusted for inflation, the shared revenue Oregon received from the state in 2003 would be more than $700,000 today. And of course, in 2023, we received $230,000. So these two sources combined, property tax, shared revenue, that makes up 87% of the revenue that we have to spend for our ongoing operating expenses, the services that we provide. So on one side, the property tax is really restricted in being able to keep up with these services. And then the second one here with shared revenue, again, we've seen some of these decreases over the years. Now, I will say in 2024, the legislature did change the law for shared revenue, and they did provide some additional funding for local governments. In fact, the village got an additional $292,000 from that change in the law in 2024. So that brought us to just a little bit over $500,000 that we got from shared revenue. So we did see a little bit of a reprieve, I guess, or some additional flexibility from that. But again, in comparison to 2003, we're talking 22 years ago, those dollars had a value of what would be today over $700,000. And it's great that we're back up to $500,000. But unfortunately, it's not where it used to be. And then, of course, as we talked about, growth. So we have these sort of external challenges with inflation, the revenue structure that is imposed on local governments from the state of Wisconsin, and then as a community, we're growing. And as I mentioned, there's things that are beneficial from that in terms of how the revenue structure works in Wisconsin for local governments, but there's certainly challenges as well. More people just means more demand on our services. Certainly means more calls for police, for public safety, certainly more use of the library, Our infrastructure, our assets are expanding to meet the growth, and we have to be able to maintain those things like streets and sidewalks and that sort of thing. And of course, here at the Senior Center, we have some increased growth as well. So, and I'll go through a couple of specifics on that as we go. So usually at this point of the conversation I have with people, or when I'm presenting some of this stuff to the village board, usually get questions on, okay, I can see the challenges here, right? I understand inflation is a problem. I understand that, you know, the state of Wisconsin imposes rules on local government, makes it difficult to have flexibility with revenue. I can understand all those things. But what has the village been doing to kind of address all of these things? Is the village making good financial decisions? Is it being frivolous with dollars? What does that look like? And, you know, obviously that's a judgment for everybody to make, but I think there's two really important things that sort of stick out to me about the village in terms of our financial stewardship and past financial stewardship. Number one, I think I've worked in 5 communities in my career, and I think every community I've worked in, residents have told me it is the highest tax community ever. And somehow I think that's following me. I'm not sure if I'm involved, but I think a good thing to sort of put into context is this chart right here, which is the village's property tax rate in comparison to all other Dane County cities and villages. And so this was for last year, for 2023. The village has pretty consistently been in the lower half, definitely below average, and typically in the lower third for the property tax rate when you compare it to all the other cities and villages in Dane County. So the village has historically been pretty efficient with the tax dollar in terms of the amount of services that we can provide and the taxes that we are raising and the rate at which we're taxing property. And by the way, too, water and sewer rates, which is another thing that the village does, very similar charts. Village's water and sewer rates, always below average historically. In fact, last year, the village's sewer rates was second to the bottom in terms of comparing cities and villages. But the water is within the bottom 40% right now. So you can go to neighboring communities south, east, north of here, and in some cases, the cost of government services is thousands of dollars more for an average resident, an average household. So in context, you know, the village has been pretty good about the cost of its services that it provides to residents, at least compared to other Dane County communities. The other thing that we often point to is the village's bond rating. So we are a AA2 bond rated community, which is really the highest bond rating that we can get for a community of our size. And what that means is when the village goes out and gets debt, we will often have a credit agency rate our creditworthiness, because then that debt has to get sold out on the public market, and investors want to know, is this community well managed? If I buy this debt, are they going to pay it? Are they going to pay this back? Do they make good decisions? And so these rating agencies, they spend a little bit of time with us. There's a number of meetings that we have when we have to go through this process, and they look at our financial management, our financial standing, our numbers. They look at our financial management policies. They actually look at the village board. They look at agendas and minutes, and they look, is the board making good decisions? Do these things make sense? And then they put together these reports, and they're out there on the internet. You can find them, and we certainly provide them to the village board. You can find them on the village website. And as I mentioned, the village consistently is AA2, the highest that we can get for a village this size. And that translates to real dollars. So if you have a good rating, we'll get better terms on interest rates for our debt and terms for our debt obligations. So certainly these third parties that take a look at what we're doing, their rating is high. I have a quote here from one of the more recent credit reports. Solid transparency and budget management balanced against a relatively restrictive institutional structure. That was their assessment of the Village of Oregon last year. And that restrictive institutional structure is what we're talking about, right? These challenges with revenue. So we actually get dinged because the state laws restrict us on flexibility for our revenue sources, which all cities and villages in Wisconsin end up getting dinged on. But so again, when people ask the question of, well, is the village making good decisions? You can disagree or agree on policy decisions and whether to build libraries or do street projects and sort of those sorts of things. But when we do those things, we set them up and we design them in a way that those financial decisions work well for the village and for the village taxpayers, at least to the best that we can do it. So I guess moving more detailed into sort of what these challenges kind of do at a more micro level on villages' services. So villages' services are relatively modest in terms of what we actually do and provide, especially compared to other communities of our size. So the village historically has focused on, I think, what most people would consider very traditional, very core local government services. Public safety, right? Police, fire, EMS, public works. So we're talking street maintenance, snow plowing, facilities, managing our parks, forestry, brush pickup, that sort of thing. We obviously operate a library. We operate the senior center, provide older adult services through it. And that's really it, other than what happens at Village Hall, which is our clerks who run the elections, and then our finance people who do the accounting and payroll, and HR functions are kind of spread around. This is pretty much all we do. We don't have a rec department, which a lot of communities have. We don't have a separate parks department. That's rolled into our public works. Our public works crew manages the parks as well. Things like Oregon Youth Center, OCA Media, those are private entities. They are nonprofits, and they do they really do public services that a lot of communities do internally and use property tax dollars for. So this is generally what the village is focused on, and this is sort of where the referendum is going to be focused on as well, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So more specifically, public works and parks service needs. So as I mentioned, what does public works do? They do street maintenance, they do snow plowing, maintain our facilities, brush control, we have monthly curbside brush pickup, we have the drop-off site as well, maintenance of the village's parkland. So obviously the village grows, it expands the services, even the existing service that we provide. There's just increased demand and increased capacity on our public works department's ability to continue to do those things. So, for example here, the street system. We've added, our street system has increased 20%. We've added 20% more miles to our street system, obviously through new growth in the last decade. Village has 28 parks, about 347 acres in parkland. That's increased 12% in the last decade. So services are not provided in a vacuum, right? There's people that have to go out and provide these services, and that's obviously staff. So when you have a certain staffing level 10 years ago, and that staffing level hasn't really changed 10 years later, but the amount of streets that you have to maintain has increased by 20%. The amount of parkland that you're maintaining has increased 12%. The amount of hours that those individuals have to be doing this work is starting to stretch, right? And that's what this is all about. So for police, same story. So 20 years ago, we were a community of about 5,000. We've doubled, obviously, of course. Last 10 years, it's almost been a 30% increase. You would expect with a higher population, we're going to get more calls, right? 76.6% increase in calls for police services over the last 20 years. This chart right here, we don't necessarily want to be Cottage Grove or McFarland, of course, but it's good to kind of compare yourself and just kind of benchmark and say, okay, are we out of line here? Do we have too much staff? Do we have too little? Are we the outlier here? And what does that mean? So, and let's examine that a little bit further. So, as you can see, for one of the lowest officer to population ratios in Dane County, these are communities that we often kind of look at and compare ourselves to make sure that we're not doing something more or doing something less that may make sense. And if we are, what does that mean? But yeah, we're one of the lowest there. We definitely compare ourselves more to those top four, and you can see we have less officers compared to population. Now, that's maybe not necessarily a problem, but the real issue comes into the types of calls for service that we have. So increasingly, especially within the last 10 years or so, we get the police department gets a lot of calls that require 2 officers to be there. So these are things like domestic disputes, domestic violence, assaults, violations of court orders, things where you need 2 people there because you need to make sure you ensure the safety of those individuals and individuals who may be around it, but also the safety of the officer as well. And so those types of calls are increasing, and so we increasingly have 2 officers that need to be at those types of calls. 10 years ago, maybe it was fine to have 2 officers on duty, and we could maintain a certain quality of service with those 2 officers. But if those 2 officers now today, 10 years later, are increasingly on those types of calls, what happens is when somebody makes a call, there's nobody available. And so we have to rely on outside agencies, we have to rely on Dane County. Hopefully they have somebody available. If they do have somebody available, they may be 15, 20 minutes away. And so that kind of gets back to sort of the strain of things start to just stretch, right? And then your expectation or what you thought was sort of the quality of service that you were getting in the community suddenly looks much different, and then you don't realize it until you make the call, and yeah, it's 20 minutes that an officer's going to be there. And so again, this sort of speaks to the reason why we're talking about a referendum here, and particularly talking about staffing. The library, of course, we opened the new library last year. And by every account that we heard, when you open a new library, it's very popular. And the Oregon Library is extremely popular. And from what we understand, that demand usually sustains itself long term. It's a little hard to see in the chart here, but I'll just rattle off some of the numbers. Visits to the library, 77,635 in 2023. 2024, 128,000, a 65% increase. Materials checked out, 187,000 in 2023, 240,000 in 2024, 27% increase. Reference questions asked, 5,901 in 23, 11,204 in 2024. It's almost a 90% increase in questions asked. Attendance at library programs, 10,000 in 23, 16,000 in 24. It's a 62% increase. Library cards issued, 837 in 23, 1,691 in 24. That's a 102% increase. First half of 2024, the library was short-staffed on 75% of the days it was open. So the library relies on a lot of part-time employees. So there's a certain amount of budget that's set aside for a certain amount of hours for those positions. And of course, people get sick, they can't come into work, people have some time off that they're allowed to take. And so in the face of double digits, triple digit increases on sort of the demands on those staff, they're doing it with staff that is not all the way up to where they would hope to be even currently. When they're understaffed 75% of the days. And same story here, the senior center. It's a pretty crazy statistic. So,
Did you say pretty creepy?
pretty crazy, maybe creepy, I don't know.
Well, either way.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty crazy. So, case management services, so we provide case management here at the senior center. 2009, 16 years ago, 15, 16 years ago. Senior center had 2 full-time case managers, served 58 adults with case management services. Over those 15 years, those hours for those case managers were reduced by 20% actually, so now they're 2 part-time employees. And that was due to funding challenges. In 2023, those 2 case managers handled 220 adults compared to the 58 adults in 2009. 279% increase, and they're doing it with 20% of the hours that they had in 2009. So again, and this is even more of, not just speaking to growth in numbers of population, but this also speaks to a demographic thing too as well, because the percentage of older adults in Dane County, including Village of Oregon, is projected to just really ramp up. And so we can expect some pretty high demand for the wonderful stuff that they do here at the senior center. As far as the rest of the village staff as a whole, a couple years ago, 2022, we did a compensation study for our staff. And on average, positions were anywhere between 6 and 14% below market rate for what they were being paid. And that's for comparable positions in comparable communities. So, a police officer, and really all of our positions in local government, we do the same types of things in all these, in every community. So, if you're a police officer and you're looking at Dane County communities, and you're one of the best and brightest police officers there is, you're going to be looking at the best pay and best benefits, and you're going to pick from a lot of really great communities in Dane County to decide where you want to go to. And if we're not at least being competitive, we don't have to set the market, we don't have to be ahead of the market, but at least if we're competitive, because we know we have a great culture and we have a great community and we can sell that. If we're at least competitive, then we can make sure that we're recruiting high quality people and we're keeping high quality people here. Because as I mentioned before, services are not delivered in a vacuum, right? They're delivered by people. And if you have good people, you can really stretch your dollar and make your dollar more effective and more efficient than people who maybe aren't as well qualified or maybe aren't the best of the best, because we can't recruit the best of the best if we're going to consistently be having 50% of our staff paid below market rate. So, so there's challenges, on the funding side, there's impacting on all of our services. So what's the solution there? So under state law, we can go to referendum and we can ask residents for additional funding. And so last year, the village board sort of went through this exercise. I mean, they understand all of these sort of issues that are happening and swirling around, and they decided that we need to really examine this and we need to really look at this, and potentially maybe we need to go to a referendum. And so we went through that process last year, and we went through an exercise of identifying needs in our departments and our services, immediate needs, but also needs that maybe are 5 and 10 years out in the future. And we issued a report. You can find it on our website that sort of outlines how that went and what the outcomes of all of that were. Then we did a community survey in the fall. We had a survey went out to every residential address in the Village of Oregon, and we asked people, what would you be willing to accept as far as a possible referendum? Are you interested in funding more short-term needs? Are you interested in funding more mid-term needs or even longer-term needs out in the future? And the response that we got was Oregon residents are primarily supportive of those core services, right? So we're talking public safety, public works, library, senior center. We care about those things. We want to make sure that those things are maintained, and we'd like to see them maintained for at least the foreseeable future, for at least the next 5-6 years. And so that's sort of the messaging that got to the village board. And in the survey, a majority of folks indicated that they would be supportive of a referendum that was just a little bit over $2 million for those purposes. And so the village board looked at that and evaluated that and decided to go with a dollar amount that was just slightly under $2 million. And so what this referendum primarily does, and here's a breakdown of sort of the uses. Stand out of the way here. New positions, about over half is for new positions. And so like we talked about, again, these services, police, public works, senior center, library, again, they're delivered by people. And so if you want those services to maintain at a certain level, it all comes down to having people. And so most of the, over 50% here of the referendum is for new positions. And taken with the next category there, additional hours for existing positions. So case managers, like we talked about, this would get them back up to full-time. So breaking down by department, that's 3 new police officers, 3 new public works crew, 2 full-time equivalents at the library, and then just under half of a full-time equivalent here at the senior center, which is those case manager positions. About 25%, a little less than 25% speaks to those wage adjustments that we're talking about with employees, existing employee salaries, trying to get some of those salaries bumped up a little bit so that we can get more into that competitive range. And then $290,000 for operational maintenance. So that's really a lot of, speaking to a lot of the sort of the inflationary stuff. So cost of utility bills, cost of, as I mentioned, buying road salt, you know, all of those sorts of things that we buy on a year-to-year basis, and making sure that we have enough money to buy those supplies so we can maintain those services moving forward. So here's the question on the ballot. This will be on, of course, on the April 1st, 2025 ballot. I'll just read it here. So under state law, the increase in the levy of the Village of Oregon for the tax to be imposed for the next fiscal year, 2026, is limited to 3.268%, which results in a levy of $10,200,777. So shall the Village of Oregon be allowed to exceed this limit and increase the levy for the next fiscal year, 2026, for the purpose of maintaining the current level of public services, including police, public works and parks, library, and senior center services, by a total of 19.116%, which results in a levy of $12,150,777, and on an ongoing basis include the increase of $1.95 million for each fiscal year going forward. And your first question might be, why on earth did you write the question that way? So here again, we're required to. So the state law dictates that we have to write this question this way. They provide the language, and then we insert our numbers, and they have to be, those numbers have to be generated in a certain way as well. The only thing we really get a lot of discretion on is for the purpose of part right there, where we can insert the language. So that's what we have to deal with. That's what will be on the ballot on April 1st. I actually had a resident reach out, and they were like, you know, I support the referendum. I think it's, I think it's a good idea to maintain our services, all that sort of thing. But why did you write the question that way? Nobody's ever going to understand what you're trying to do. Unfortunately, that's what we have to deal with state law.
Excuse me, are you?
Yeah.
Since they're stating that would be moving forward, the 1.95 million.
Yep.
But that doesn't say 1.9.
Are you anticipating that would be a stable amount, or is it going to, oh, there you go. Thank
Yep.
you.
Perfect timing.
Just want to thank me
Yeah, yes, yep, thank you. You were a plant I had you set up, yep. So, yes, so that is a great question and a question we get. So the ongoing basis, what does that mean? So that means an approved referendum would result in a one-time permanent increase to establish a new base for the property tax levy for those operating expenses. The increase would not compound year over year. So what that means is, let's say it's approved. So for your tax bill that you would receive in December of this year, we would add the 1.95 million into the levy, and so then you would see the impact on your property tax bill in December of this year. But that's where it would stay. You wouldn't see any additional impact the year after due to this referendum. The 1.95 simply stays in the referendum, in the levy amount moving forward. You know, maybe an example of people are familiar with the school district, of course, had a referendum a few years ago. They did kind of a stair-step referendum, which was a 3-year. They added in some of it, then they came back the next year, added some over top of that, and then the third year they added a little bit more over the top of that. That's not what this is. It's just 1 year. It comes on, 1.95 million, and that's where it stays in the levy moving forward.
Sir,
Yeah.
can you back up to
Sorry.
what the referendum says? We just discussed 1.95 million according to page 1 here, but this is written as 10 million.
So the levy anticipated for this upcoming year. So part of the challenge with putting this question together is we have to make some projections on being able to estimate what our levy is actually going to be. So that 10 million is where we actually think our levy is going to be for 2026 without a referendum. That's the whole village levy that we're talking about. If we add in the 1.95, we get that $12 million number at the bottom. So we're talking about, what they're showing here by this question is, here's what the levy is going to be. Here's what the levy will look like if you add the 1.95 in, and then the increase is then broken out there at the end that this 1.95 is being added in and will continue moving forward.
So the levy of 10 million is what you're assuming you're going to be getting in taxes?
Correct.
From previous years, basically?
Correct, yep.
So is the school district or school system a part of this at all? Are they totally separate and will always be separate?
They are separate, yep. This only has to do with the village.
So we have to think about, we're going to get assessed for school costs and also assessed for village costs.
Correct, yep. Yeah, and that was, you know, as I mentioned at the earlier part of the presentation is, you know, you get that tax bill, right? There's just a $1 amount. You write that check out, you send it to the village. Some people think the village gets everything, right? And they'll tell us about it when they pay. But of course, we have to remind people, no, that dollar amount, yes, you're paying to us, but we end up having to give the shares out to all the other taxing districts, right? And like I said, 53% of your tax bill ends up with the school district. We keep about 29% this last year. You send 14% to Dane County and then 4% to the tech college, so.
So I'm thinking about taking some of that burden off of our elderly residents. This is an old community, and our elders are increasing in numbers, as is the issue across the United States, of course. So, is there any way that you will be assessing property taxes for those younger, richer people who recently moved in?
Like the older people
And
that already
who,
reached.
well, and who the property owners, developers are targeting right now? Is there any way that there can be some compensation between what the more wealthy people can afford
Sure.
versus what the elders can afford?
Yep. All right, I'll answer this question, and then I want to finish my presentation, then we'll do Q&A.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, property tax law, and this is actually baked into the Wisconsin Constitution, property taxes have to be uniformly applied. We can't make exceptions for different classes of residents, whether age or some other factor. So when we have to assess property taxes, it has to be done based on property assessment values. And that has to be uniform, and there's no way that we can sort of overcome that.
How do we change that law? In this day and age, considering equity, that and diversity,
Yep.
which includes the elders, there are a lot of things that really have to be starting to be addressed
Oh, yeah.
because there isn't equity anymore. We can't just charge everybody the same because the elders don't have that income to live on. So
Absolutely.
we have to account for that.
You won't get any disagreement from me on that,
I
but.
know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
What I'm doing is I'm putting it out to our public here so that we look at that and say, how can we affect that change? The other thing I see is the state has been now for a couple of years saying they have a lot of money that they don't know what to do with now because they've taxed everybody to the max. And I'm thinking, they're saying they want to give the money back to the taxpayer. I'm thinking we need to go to the state and we need to say to them, not to the taxpayer, but to the communities in which those individuals live. Because the individuals are depending on the communities for services. We need to make sure those services are available for them. And this is what they should be spending their tax money on anyway. But you know, people don't do that. When they get their tax refund, they go out and buy a new car. How does that help the whole community?
I'm right there with you. No, you've hit on a line of, this is something I know a lot of village board members feel exactly the way you do, and they express it a lot in our meetings when we talk about this. You know, again, like you said, you got to advocate to your state legislatures and do that sort of thing, and we certainly try to do that when appropriate. Yeah, I mean, we have to deal with what is, you know.
I'm thinking we need to start revolting. Your seniors are going to be marching in the streets with our walkers.
All right, I will finish out my presentation here. And then happy to take more questions and comments as well. So as far as the referendum, so 1.95 is what's being put on the ballot. Okay, what is the impact to property tax, to property taxes? So relatively straightforward way to kind of think of this. So for every $100,000 of assessed property value, almost $100, $99.74. Median value home in Oregon was $430,000 last year. It's about $428, $35 a month. I think turns out to about $1.17 a day for a median value home.
That's a lot for an elderly person when our Social Security has just been reduced.
Yeah, it doesn't even go up.
So, and that's a great point. I think the thing to sort of think in the context of that, in terms of, you know, this goes back to the first slide, right, of inflation. We know, we hear, I know elected officials hear exactly what you're saying all the time.
I mean, we can't forget this. We cannot just
Absolutely.
slip it under the rug like it doesn't make any difference.
Right. And the sort of the challenge, the friction there is, you know, the reality is, you the challenges we have are the challenges that we have, and we have the services that we provide. And unfortunately, there's a cost to that, right? And in order to maintain that, and with these sorts of things that we've talked about, those costs to maintain those services are going up. And so you as a resident, and all of you and all of us, have to sort of look at this sort of referendum and say, what can we live with? What is the limit here? And maybe you look at this and you say, okay, I like the services that we have. I want to maintain them. I understand I'm going to have to pay, a couple $100s more, a few $100s more, but it's what I'm willing to do to maintain it. Or another perfectly valid opinion is, I don't want to. I can't. I don't have enough.
Somewhere else, not just to your consumer here, but I think we need to start going to the state, maybe even the county, to say, you've got this extra money sitting out there. Give it to the communities who need it.
Right.
That law should be changed, because we want the money to go to the communities, and we can say that.
So,
Well, that's the issue. We need to start saying it, because otherwise it will never happen.
yep, I don't disagree with you. So we know what will happen if the referendum passes, right? So we're able to do sort of these things to maintain existing services. What happens if it doesn't happen? And there's no plan that's like in place right now. The village board hasn't sort of set out what exactly that is going to look like. It's something that we'll certainly evaluate if the referendum is rejected. But it's going to most likely take the shape of sort of these things here. Number one, an easy way to save costs is we're just not open as much. Does the library, does the senior center, does the village hall need to be closed 1-2 days a week? That way, staff aren't there then, we're not paying staff, or at least some of the staff aren't there, and we don't have to pay them.
The federal government just wanted to cut out meals
Okay.
for seniors.
I certainly appreciate your
They put
comment.
that back in, thank God, because that's a trickle down again from the federal government.
I certainly appreciate your comments. I don't disagree with any of it, but if we could just let Martin finish, and then we can do the questions.
Sure, but I want to remind us,
Well,
impact from other,
I'll be happy to give you another chance to remind us when Martin's done.
okay.
The next one here, we can find other revenue, right? And there's limited revenue options that villages, local governments have in Wisconsin. But there are some things that we can do, and honestly, a lot of those additional services and fees create a lot more overhead. So then you're sort of creating more costs by even creating them themselves. But it is an option to potentially consider some more increased or additional fees for services. Going back to the police department, challenge public safety services. Again, as we talked, if we don't have the sort of staffing that maybe was sufficient 10 years ago for the amount of calls and the population that we had, that type of service might look a little bit different. We may not be able to respond consistently within 5 minutes or less. It may take a little bit more. Reduce public works services, deferred maintenance. Again, Public Works provides a lot of services. We do monthly brush pickup. We do curbside brush pickup. We have the drop-off site. We maintain the parks. We snow plow and salt. Maybe we think about those differently. Maybe we're not plowing every street before or right after a storm event ends. Maybe it's we're waiting. You're having to wait 24 hours for certain streets to be plowed. Impact quality of life services like Oregon Public Library, Oregon Area Senior Center. Both those functions do a lot of programs, do a lot of different services and that sort of thing. Maybe we're just simply doing less. We just can't do as much as we have done in the past. Reduced availability of absentee voting hours. This kind of gets to a little bit more of what happens at Village Hall, but absentee voting is huge in the Village of Oregon, absolutely huge. And the clerks are basically operating an election 2 weeks before the election happens every day now. And there is cost to that. There's poll workers, there's staff, there's time. And so maybe we need to think differently about this service that we offer in allowing people to come basically all business hours to vote. And so I'm almost done here. You know, this is sort of the summary of what we're getting at with the referendum. Additional funding would ensure the village can maintain its high-quality police, public works, parks, library, senior center services programs at existing levels. So the level that that residents have known and come to expect, you know, certainly within recent history. We're not trying to do anything more. We're trying to do just what we've been doing and maintain what we're doing. And we've set up the referendum so that this referendum would certainly cover, you know, through the end of the decade, through the next 5, 6, 7 years for what we think might be needs. So just a little information on voting. It's on April 1st. Obviously you need your photo ID in order to vote. You can go to myvote.wi.gov, learn information about voting. You can also call the clerk's department. And now I can answer some questions.
I have a question. I was going through some old records and happened to find my tax bill from 2013.
I can repeat it too.
Okay, but my taxes back then were $1,500, and my assessed value, of course, was a lot less. Now my assessed value has doubled, and I'm paying $6,000 for taxes. You know, is the assessment going to keep going up year after year after year?
So I think most people heard that, but comparing your assessment and taxes from 2013 to what you're seeing today, and his assessment's going to continue. So property assessment is another thing that is regulated at the state level. So assessment is done at the local level. So as a local government, we are required to have an assessor who does property assessment. But the local government doesn't really have any discretion on how assessment actually occurs. It is dictated by the state. There's a uniform manual on assessment, and assessors have to follow that in terms of setting assessments and that sort of thing. And of course, residents have the opportunity to dispute that if they would like. There's a process for that. But predominantly, assessments are set by fair market value of, or what they think is the fair market value of the property. And so a good rule of thumb when you get your assessment is, do you think you could sell your property for that amount? And if the answer is, yeah, probably, then it's correct. The assessment is correct.
It's not, because comparable houses in my neighborhood are selling for about 150,000 less
Sure.
than what I'm assessed at.
So in those cases, I would say, you know, your opportunity to talk to the assessor, we have, it's called open book. You can talk to the assessor directly.
Okay.
If you generally think that your assessment is more than what you would get if you sold it, then you might have something there, and you should talk to the assessor about it.
That's good to know.
But yeah, I mean, as long as the market is doing what it's doing, the assessments have to sort of track the market.
Right, I get that.
And I think one thing that we hear a lot about is, you know, my assessment went up, so my taxes went up. And that's not necessarily true. The amount of taxes that the village or any of the taxing jurisdictions, for that matter, levy is a defined amount. You know, as we talked about, it's only a certain amount. We don't get more property taxes just because existing value went up. It's redistributed based on the new types of the new value that's there. So as I mentioned, we can only raise property taxes based on new construction value. That's entirely what it's based on. And if we have new debt, you know, so you know, taxes can go up that way as well. So there's not necessarily a direct causation between my value went up and now my taxes went up. There's a little bit more nuance happening in there. Certainly it happens a lot of the time, but there are certainly cases where some values I've seen residents, their values have gone up, but their taxes actually went down because their value went up, or went up slower in relation to everybody else's, or at least the majority of everybody else's. So their portion of the pie shrunk a little bit, even though their value went up. So you can see it kind of, it's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah,
Just,
I understand.
yep. Yep.
I'm sorry, I came in late, so if you covered this in your presentation, I apologize, but the wheel taxes and the light taxes were passed to cover part of that gap that's there. I'm assuming since those were passed by the village and this is a referendum, is this meant to include that? Has there been discussion around removal of those?
Yep. Yeah, so that was a discussion during last year when we talked about the possibility of going to referendum is, you know, we put these two revenue options that local governments have in place a couple of years ago now. And for just the reasons why we talked about it was to find different sources of revenue to keep supporting our services. So we did ask that question in the community survey of, would you support replacing these two fees with property taxes? So we would get rid of those, and instead we'd raise property taxes to the referendum to cover what those funds are now covering. And the response we got back was, majority was no. It was about 40% were supportive, 60% were not. And I think for most people, and this is, you know, my speculation, if you have 2 or 3 cars, I think a lot of people figured out, if it went to property taxes, I'd actually be paying more in property taxes than I do just by paying these couple of fees over here. So I think there was a calculation in a lot of people's minds of like, this maybe doesn't make sense to me, I'd rather just pay the fees, I don't want it on my property taxes. And so that, you know, the board, obviously we don't want to put a question on the ballot that it's going to be risky in terms of not passing or passing, at least within a margin of error. And when only 40% of 1,100 responses was supportive, the board decided to not include it in the referendum.
So as of right now, this passes, those fees remain in place until the board would take some action.
Right. Yeah, those fees are covering ongoing operational costs to the tune of about $450,000. So again, it gets back to the problem of operational spending. If we got rid of those, we have to find $450,000 now to maintain our services. I think I saw it.
I just had a question about how long do you think this is gonna last? For example, in 2 years, are you gonna be coming to us again in 10 years, in 6 months? It just.
Yep. Yeah, no, this amount of funding, and I think I mentioned this, we feel really good about this amount of funding being supportive of operational services for the next 5 to 6, 7 years through the end of the decade. And that was really in response to what we got back on the survey, which was people really didn't want to be taxed more for stuff that we needed much farther beyond that, right? They were okay with, okay, what you need in the next 5, 6, 7 years, we're okay with, but when we get to that point, we'll see what the environment is like, and maybe the state laws have changed completely and the whole dynamic has changed, right?
If and this does not pass, would you come to us again with a lower amount?
I think it's a potential possibility, yeah. I think you were next.
I have a question regarding the developers. Are they getting any type of user fees or anything to help cover some of these expenses?
Yes,
Because
yes.
of what they're adding into
Oh, yes.
the village?
Yes. Yeah, the village has a number of impact fees on new development. Every single family home that's built in Oregon, we probably collect upwards of 10,000 plus impact fees, which go to a variety of different purposes. There's a portion that goes to help pay for the new library. There's a portion that goes to pay for new parks and parks improvements. There's a portion that goes to the water utility, a portion that goes to the sewer utility. And in some cases, particularly on the west side, we have a sort of a special sort of fee for new development happening on the west side for different types of street infrastructure. There's an even greater cost there. So yeah, the village has collected millions of dollars in impact fees. But the challenge with those fees is they're one time, right? So we get them, and then there's no guarantee that we're gonna get a reliable or consistent amount year to year. And for impact fees in Wisconsin, we're restricted to using those fees for like capital projects and capital costs. So, like we can collect a library impact fee, we need to spend that money on the debt service for the new library. We can't spend it on anything else. Same thing with parks. We have to spend it on library projects. We can't spend it on operating stuff. So, and we wouldn't be able to reasonably rely on it, because if growth slowed down, then we would have some questions about our ability to fund our ongoing operating costs.
I have a couple questions. In response to hers, you said single-family dwellings just now. What about the apartment
Oh, yeah.
complexes we're seeing?
It's even more
And-
magnified
and-
than,
and is it good?
yeah, so it's
Because
based on
the
dwelling.
changes that makes in the community are horrendous.
We, no, it's the impact fees from development that the village has are based on dwelling units. So not, I just gave single family as an example. But yeah, the multifamily apartment buildings that we built in recent years, I can remember one that I think they cut a $600,000 check in park impact fees for the village.
Okay.
And they have to pay the
That
same
pays the-
fees.
But that mows the grass.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I mean, development of course has challenges, but certainly within the funding structure for ongoing operating costs, there are benefits, but then there's also sort of these fees that we can collect on the other side of it, which allow us to limit the burden on existing
Right.
residents.
And I think that's what people figured out with the streetlights and the vehicles, is that the property owner shouldn't be paying for everybody's vehicle and everybody's streetlight. So
Yeah,
I
and
think that's the real reason people are saying,
and that's
no,
good.
leave it there.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. The
yes.
streetlight fee is charged
Yes.
to properties that don't get taxed as well.
Yes,
So we were able to
right.
collect from different sorts
Yes.
of, yeah.
Here's another one, just a what if. One of your big things that you keep going back and that you've mentioned several times are the snow plows and the salting. My whole family is in the process of becoming and have become residents of Montana. In Montana, there is no road salt put on any road anywhere. And it's full of mountains and valleys, and they've figured out how to do it. We can figure it out too. The street that I live on, if there is a snow day, I have snow plows that make the trip back and forth in front of my house, sometimes 12 times. So, I lived in the town of Rome, I drove on packed snow. You learn to drive on packed snow. You don't need bare pavement on every single street on the day the snow falls. So I think there are things we could do that would be healthier for us, considering how much salt it takes to ruin how much water. That it would be something that no matter what happens up here on your board, we take a look at that, because it's only gonna benefit all of us.
Absolutely. No, and I grew up in a small family farm in the country, and your level of expectation is exactly
That's right.
what you're saying. And we knew, growing up, living out in the country, that plow probably wasn't gonna come by our road until a day or two after the storm was over, and we planned accordingly, right? And so that's sort of the question here that our residents are being asked is, what is your expectation? I mean, if you're looking at this and you're like, I can live with less. That's your assessment, and that's the question, right? And that's why, a referendum is a great way to do this, because residents get to say, and you get to decide what kind of quality of service you want.
And we've been getting less snow every year.
Yeah.
Could you discuss how capital projects impact any of this? Like the park
Yep,
across the street,
yep.
the library?
So, I would say a couple things. Number one, not really at all. In terms of, let's say for example, we never did a library project, or we never did JC Park or whatever. I can almost guarantee we would be here having a referendum the same, no matter what.
Where does the money go then?
So, and that's what I was talking to you earlier about. The property taxes that come to the village are really made up of two different sorts of things. There is a portion that is for the operating, there's a portion that goes to pay for debt. And when we talk about capital projects, we fund a lot of those big projects through, we get a lot of grants, donations, things like that, but a lot of it is through debt. We take out debt. And as I mentioned, the property tax law in Wisconsin is very flexible for taking on additional property taxes to make debt payments. So local governments have an incredible amount of flexibility to build a new library, but then when you actually have to go to fund the operation of it, it's extremely restrictive. So the ability to pay the employees, the ability to buy the books and do all that stuff, pay the electric bill, that is hard capped to new construction value in the community. So absolutely, projects increase property taxes if that's the source of funding that is being used. But it doesn't impact on the operating side in terms of the amount of funding that we can get and in order to sustain those services.
Don't you take those operating expenses into consideration? When you build a park that's gonna need more lawn mowing to keep those beautiful fields that nobody uses in shape, because, I mean, they are exceptional for what we need. And the library, you already know that a new library is going to draw more people using the facility. Before you build those things, don't you go, geez, we're not gonna have enough people to run these things. And that's just a small, that's just a couple of things. There's other projects that I see that are in kind of the planning stage around town that might be the same. So where do you draw the line?
Well, again, it comes back to expectation on service. So if you don't want a new library, if you don't want parks improvements, if you're okay with streets being a certain kind of quality or not quality, there's a cost to doing those things.
I just wish you would have more question and answers like this, or referendums, I should say, on things like the park and other capital projects before they are passed and they go through. And let us say, well, how's this gonna impact us, instead of finding out too late and then finding out that they're understaffed. That's the thing.
Well, and again, if you've assessed, you don't find the referendum to be something you want to vote for, then the quality of service from whatever the asset, the capital infrastructure, will be changed. And so, yes, we have a new library, but if we don't want to maintain the operating or the operating costs moving forward, well, then maybe that library needs to be closed once a week or twice a week. So you sort of have to balance that out, right? And everybody's going to make their own decision on assessment of that.
Yes, it just seems like there's a little bit of duplication of services with the case management that's going on. That's also a free service through ADRC of Dane County. And I don't quite understand why there is duplication. I'm sure it's a marvelous service they're doing, I understand the mission, but I don't understand how it became an entity when ADRC is established, and really something you're gonna have to go through if you get into requiring medical assistance. You're gonna have a case manager that will be appointed to you. I think it's just delaying the inevitable of that relationship in the future anyway. And the other thing with the youth center that you talked about, it sounded like you're using some of the taxpayers' money to support it at some level. And it doesn't sound from like what I'm hearing in the community that it's very well attended. And you do have marvelous activities built in already at the library for the teens and tweens for after-school activities. And to me, it would make sense just to flush all that money into the library and get rid of the other entity that apparently isn't very successful and would be a drain, based on, preserving that venue. So that's my other comment. And my third comment is on the salting, and I think, I love the trails here, but I was really surprised that you're even salting the trails very excessively, I might add. And you just put in all new blacktop along the library, and it's gonna destroy it. So now if we talk about trying to maintain things, it worries me that you're gonna be degrading that composition very quickly. I mean, like this winter, we only had maybe one salting, because we had no snow. But, I think the trails are great. I don't expect it, I use them, but I don't expect it to be salted. I think there's a lot of opportunity. Sand would be cheaper. There's always ways to save money, And, the parks, maybe they don't mow, every week, maybe it's every two weeks or whatever, but there's always ways to save money.
Absolutely. Yeah, I will say, as far as, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's always ways to save money. I think the challenge that we have found, especially in the last couple of years, is, we can find maybe $1,000 here, $1,000 there. But we're talking, to the tune of millions of dollars of need for maintaining some of these services. And so, our budgets are out on the website. They're out there for people to take a look at. We have our budget presentations. You can find them on YouTube. I think what people would find is, absolutely, we can save some money if we made some changes to certain things. But that's going to get us, single digits or maybe 10% of the way of some of the need that we have for the services for the entire village.
I understand that you are an advocate for the village and what goes on there, and I appreciate that. I just think that if you do any more capital improving, you should really figure in the cost of the operation and the insurance and the maintenance of these buildings. We all love the new library, it's beautiful, and the people there are exceptional. But somebody had to look at the fact that the insurance for this building over here was probably a quarter of what that is over there. And I think that's really something you need to do. I understand we're looking at a new senior center at some point. If you build it, they will come. If you build a nice library, people are gonna drive over there. And if you build a nice senior center, people are gonna come and expect services from that senior center. I attended a meeting not real long ago about revamping the comprehensive plan for revamping the Triangle Park and all that. And we all want beautiful things and exceptional things, but this is a hard room for that. Some of us are struggling to, make ends meet. And it's hard to think, people are making decisions for us, and we elected those people, and I understand that, but making decisions that are gonna impact whether or not we can pay our bills. And and I think you guys have to really think about that carefully before you start, jumping into any more capital improvement things.
Sure.
Another thing, this place exists because we have lots and lots of volunteers.
Absolutely.
So at the library, if they need somebody, maybe a couple hours a week or so, to put books away, can't they get some volunteers in there to help with some of that stuff?
Yes, they do use quite a few volunteers at the library. For programs, for different types of tasks. Yeah, they do use, and we use a lot of volunteers across all of the village operation. Here especially, and I mean, we use volunteers for certain types of projects in our parks, you know, tree plantings and maintaining plantings and that sort of thing. A lot of poll workers volunteer their time. They can be paid, but a lot of them have the option of, they choose not to be paid. So yeah, I mean, we have hundreds and hundreds of volunteers across all of the village operation.
What about new businesses in the area to increase our tax revenue?
Yep.
Have you done much with that? I know there's a committee, somebody's supposed to be looking into that, right?
Yeah,
I didn't
no.
expect to hear that there were gonna be 2 vaping
Yeah, vaping
buildings,
places.
and I heard there's another vaping building coming in.
They're here.
New commercial and industrial businesses, that sort of thing. Huge, significant priority for the village board right now. The challenge is, those things don't happen overnight, right? And there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of political willpower over multiple years. You might have to spend some money.
We've done multiple years, I know that. We just haven't increased that
They're not
much.
real
all year.
The village of Oregon has never been real receptive for new businesses, especially if there was an established business of the same kind, like grocery store or the Great Dane comes to mind. They wanted to come in town and they wouldn't let them because it would hurt Mulligan's and headquarters, you know, so they're not real receptive to new businesses.
And you know, as somebody who came to this community 4 years ago, I would say there's a certain degree of that is accurate, because if you look at, you know, past village comprehensive plans, past village planning policies, there was a heavy tilt towards, we want to be a bedroom community. We want to have, this is where we want to live. We don't want to have a lot of different diversity of uses in the community. And that's what people wanted and supported for,
And they still do.
I'd say
because they
40,
don't-
50 years. And so now, from what I've seen, that mentality has changed quite a bit, I would say, within the last maybe 5, maybe 10 years. And so now there's a real push and a real interest from a lot of elected officials that have already come and gone since I've been here, and currently, we want to be a little bit more diverse in terms of, we just don't want to be a bedroom community. We want to have commercial, and we want to have, you know, places for jobs and things like that. And as I said, there's, you know, again, it's not something that happens overnight. It takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of challenges that Oregon has to address that, because number one, land has to be available and ready to be able to be used for those types of uses. And if you haven't noticed, Oregon is awfully wet in a lot of areas. And so that limits abilities to the east and maybe to the south a little bit. To the north, we're cut off right by the city of Fitchburg, and we can't go beyond that. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges with doing that, and you also have to have cooperative property owners. The village just can't take somebody's property and do with it what it wants. So there's a lot of factors that factor into that, and it just takes time.
That being said, though, our downtown district is shrinking all the time. Right now, we've got apartment buildings coming on both sides of the downtown area. One where the old Methodist church was, one on kind of across from Maria's Pizza. How is that leaving? That should be, in my mind, that should be planning for trying to get more businesses in there. The first business that will draw people to downtown, unless the village is trying to get, as it has everything else, push everything out by the Bergamot, like the city hall, and soon probably the fire department will want to build out there too. I don't understand the plan, and we should know those things before we're voting on a referendum, because all these things will affect our pocketbook, not only just the referendum itself.
So downtown specifically, there is a master plan. It was literally just adopted last week.
last week.
There was a whole year-long community engagement process. There was a couple surveys, there was a couple workshops, and there was a number of people, that participated. 400, 500 people participated in the surveys. So there are those opportunities that are out there for giving input on the future of different things, including downtown specifically. And so you can see, you can go to the website, you can find that plan, and you can see, okay, this is what the village wants to do with certain different properties and what its plans might be. So that information, it's out there. It's out on the website. You can find it.
Does it explain though that this would have economic effect on people because we're not having the businesses come in and we're actually killing the downtown? Is all that?
It depends on what specifically we're talking about, but these decisions won't happen tomorrow or next week, but there'll be decisions that happen over multiple years. And of course, village boards change and they can change priorities and that sort of thing as well. So, but there's a plan out there based on feedback from the public of how people would like to see certain things, and you sort of try to aim towards that as a community of trying to fulfill those sorts of things, but there's also a lot of other factors, and time is one of
We
them.
also look for the board to guide us, to help us understand some of these things. And say, well, maybe you won't want to do that. I don't know, that's just my thoughts. I hate to see downtown just go away.
Sure.
There's being less and less down there now.
Head this one over here.
From the last board meeting, when they talked about that, I was impressed about the fact that the statement was made that these are suggestions for people that want to do development within the area. This is what we'd like to see. It wasn't the village is going to build this. So, relax.
Yes. Well, yeah, a lot of the development is based on the private market, right? We have to rely on that.
Does Fitchburg get taxed more for using our school? How does that?
Yeah, about a third of the city of Fitchburg is in the Oregon School District. And yeah, the way that works out is, the school district sets their levy, the amount of taxes that they need to get, and then that's divided based on assessed value. So it's uniformly applied to people in Fitchburg, people in the Village of Oregon, people in the surrounding towns, anybody that's in the school district. I want to say that Fitchburg pays maybe this is offhand 30% of the school district's property tax levy. I think it's about somewhere in that range.
When new construction is going to be made in the next few years, I'm thinking about the increased costs of construction materials because of the tariffs that our new government wants to put on us. So what's that going to look like then with regard to our increase in property taxes? Because kind of spread this across everybody in general, right?
Yeah, tariffs, from the village's perspective, those things can have a pretty big impact on things like materials, especially for things like construction projects, street construction projects, things like that, building projects, that sort of nature. So yeah, that is absolutely a factor that the village and everybody's going to have to keep an eye on, as far as maybe we thought something was going to cost a certain amount of money, but now it's not. And are we going to need to maybe delay a project, or maybe do half of the project, if it's a street project or something like that. So yeah, we have to assess those things as they come, and the board has to make decisions.
How do we address the federal government on some of that?
That's another different meeting.
We need Elon Musk.
Any other questions you can answer? Yeah.
I just have a quick question. How many employees does the village have
So
total?
the village has, in terms of full-time equivalents,
Yeah.
so if we add all our part-times
FTEs,
in,
right.
I believe it's 68 full-time equivalents.
Do you have an HR manager now?
We do not.
Who does the HR work?
It is spread amongst myself, our clerk's department, and then our finance department, so we kind of divvy up those
Would you consider it
responsibilities.
an outside service that does HR work?
It's certainly on some things.
I mean, you wouldn't have to pay for an HR person's benefits.
Right, yes, yeah, certainly for some things, we certainly could. But yeah, we see a benefit of the amount of work that's being done and the complexity of the work being done is, you know, we're an operation of, I don't know, $10 million, we have 68 full-time equivalents.
Yeah.
You know, I think we have maybe, what, 50 full-time, and then we have, I don't know, 50 part-time altogether, so, you know, things are becoming increasingly complex for
Yeah, and I can see,
managing
the
resources.
validity of having an HR person for the village. That makes sense to me,
Yep.
based on the fact that they recommend between 25 and 50 employees that you have one.
Yeah. Employment practices liability is a huge thing, and you want somebody paying attention to it, not
Yes.
a group of people that have other things that they have to do as well. Anything else to answer?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.